I actually saw them when a constituent kind of reported them to me because they were quite concerned about what they'd seen. And it's a difficult one, really, because I think as politicians, on the one hand, you've got your own personal opinions and you should be perfectly free to, express those as you will. But on the other hand, I think you have to have in the back of your mind that you're representing a large section of the community. So, in my case, anything I do could be reflective of how people might see the Isle of Man or how people might see Ramsey. And so you always got to have that in the back of your mind, I think. So it's a really difficult balance to strike when you feel strongly about something and you want to express your own view, but also then, because of the job you've got or the role that you're in, you do have those wider responsibilities.
And do you think the public rightly expects higher standards of behaviour from those elected to public office, regardless of the level of responsibility?
I think they do, and I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think for people to expect, if I'm going to elect someone and put my trust in them, and you expect the people you elect to be responsible, you expect them to be following the core principles of operating in public life, you expect them to be held to that higher standard. And I think the challenge we have here on the island is because most of our politicians are independents. There isn't really a mechanism for politicians to be held to those standards. So in our case in Tynwald, for example, it's up to Tynwald to enforce standards on itself, which doesn't always work very well, as we've seen recently in a couple of cases. And it's the same at a local authority level. Their complaints process, there isn't one really for the most part, but ultimately it's up to the local authority to decide to police itself and for members to police themselves. And I don't think that is necessarily the best way forward. I think at least when you have some sort of party structure, there are consequences for behaviour and actions. And you see that in the UK only in the last week, where ministers have been sacked or been forced to resign because they've fallen foul of their own party's rules and their own party's guidance. Whereas that isn't something we really have on the island.
And something which you spoke about earlier was that all politicians, it's human nature to have personal feelings about particular topics. But obviously you're an MHK. How do you go about balancing what you personally believe versus what might be in the best interests of the community?
Very carefully, I think would be my answer to that. I kind of have a three-tier approach to the way I approach things. So, the first thing is I would never say or do anything that was against my conscience. I think that is really important. Then the next step down is what I'm doing in the best interest of my constituents in the island, because that obviously has to be your primary concern. And then beneath that would be my concern around whether it's something my party would support. So that's kind of the order of things. But generally speaking, I try and engage positively with people wherever I can. So it's hard to be positive all the time. I get that, but sometimes it's best to say nothing. I think is tends to be my approach. If you don't think what you're expressing is representative of the position that you hold or of the people that you're supposed to represent, then I tend to find just don't wade into that conversation.
And where do you think the line should be drawn between freedom of expression and comments that may be seen as damaging to public trust?
And that, I think, is the million-dollar question. And I don't think anyone can really answer that, because ultimately it's up to the people who elect us to decide whether we, have crossed any lines, whether we represent them in the way that they expect us to be representing them. And I think that's the way it should be, actually. It should be up to the public to decide if their representatives are doing the job we elected them to do. And that's it's going to be different for every constituency. It's going to be different for every person within that constituency, I think. And that's where I think you do run into these problems, because ultimately, there are 7,000 people in my constituency. It might be that some of them are quite happy with a certain type of approach and some of them aren't. And so trying to find that balance is really, really difficult, I think. And I don't really think it's up to one politician to draw a line for another to say, well, actually, I didn't think that was acceptable. Fair enough. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But really, it isn't up to me to tell someone else how to do their job or how to police the things that they say or don't say. Ultimately, it's up to the electorate to decide whether they're happy with our performance.
It's interesting because the rules in their current state only allow for symbolicism, effectively, a no confidence motion in a local authority setting or indeed in the House of Keys bears no legal significance. Do you think motions with that level of gravity and seriousness should carry more weight than what is effectively a symbolic gesture?
It's tricky, really, because on the one hand, you think you want the bodies themselves to be able to police behaviour, to be able to make sure that they're operating effectively. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that some of our, especially our smaller local authorities, I don't know if they've got the resources to do these sorts of investigations properly. I don't know if they've got access to the right level of support. I know as commissioners, you definitely don't. I mean, there isn't a great deal of support around you. You've got your staff ultimately, but really you're on your own. That's just the way it is, the way it always has been, I think, on the island. And really it's the same as an MHK. You don't have access to, wide-ranging support of all kinds to help get you through some of this stuff. And so really it is about individuals. And so would I feel comfortable giving an organisation that level of kind of authority in legal terms? I don't know if I would. Actually, I'd be worried about it being abused possibly for political reasons, people having political differences and then using a conduct system as a method of attacking their colleagues. So I'm not really sure I would go that far. I think what I expect is if an organisation like a Board of Commissioners or Tynwald, for example, resolves not to have confidence in someone or to censure someone or whatever it may be, that actually that individual takes that on board themselves and does the right thing, because that's really what our whole political system is based on, is that we elect people to have integrity and we like our politicians to do what they say they're going to do. And so you'd expect in that circumstance, if there was a vote of no confidence somewhere or if there was a vote of censure, for example, then the individual concerned would actually stand up and take ownership of that and actually take accountability for whatever it is they may have said or done.
And when you say does the right thing, is that a resignation?
I think it depends. I think it depends on what you've done ultimately, and it depends on what the public view is out there. It could be that an apology is sufficient, and if you look at the way Tynwald standards work, the starting point is always some sort of apology, and actually that's pretty routine in Tynwald. If you misspeak in a debate, if you say the wrong thing, people stand up and say, "Look, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean that," or "I said something that came out wrong." That's perfectly fine. If you've done something more serious, ultimately, there are things like you can be suspended or you can ultimately be asked to resign. But that really is a matter for the individual politician to decide, well, what is it that's happened? What is it that the public feel? What is it my electorate are telling me? And what is it that I've actually been sanctioned for doing? And there's a whole range of ways people can respond, I think, appropriately to that. It's hard to have a kind of blanket approach that said, if you've done X, then Y must happen. I don't think the system works like that.
And more broadly, do you think that the tone of political discourse on the island is deteriorating? Because, it wasn't that long ago that another Ramsey commissioner faced a no-confidence motion over her use of language on social media.
Policing social media is really difficult, and I think you do see things get out of hand quite quickly. And I think with social media, it's very easy to misinterpret things people have posted because you lose tone, you lose context, you lose all the kind of nuance that you get when you're in a face-to-face conversation. But I think generally speaking, I do think the political discourse is gradually sliding backwards. It is getting worse. You've seen this in Tynwald quite recently, where there was a conduct debate involving the Chief Minister and some of the language that he used and some of the accusations he threw around. But actually, Tynwald decided, that's fine. It's perfectly okay now to accuse other members of making false statements or to be gaslighting each other. And actually, I would have thought a year ago that wouldn't have been okay. 5 years ago, that wouldn't have been okay. But actually, it does feel like the whole political atmosphere is getting a bit more toxic, not just on the island, but worldwide. You can see it in the media every day, I think. And so it is concerning that we do seem to be sliding backwards down that slope.
A lot of people will be looking at what's happening in the UK with the number of sackings and resignations and wondering whether public accountability should play a part here.
I think you're right. I think it absolutely should. But if you look at what's happening in the UK, those are the reactions of a political party to things that are going on that are contrary to that party's values. It's not really about government. You haven't seen Parliament in the UK take a vote on any of these sackings or resignations recently. That hasn't happened. They've been individual politicians and individual party structures making those calls as to people that should be suspended, have the whip removed, or people that have resigned or been sacked as a result of things they've said or done. But that's kind of the advantage you have when you have some sort of party structure built around your political system, is there at least is some form of political accountability, because there's some form of collective responsibility there. The Prime Minister in the UK isn't just the Prime Minister, he's also the leader of a party, and the actions of his party members reflect on him, they reflect on his government, and so inevitably they have to take action when things go wrong, and that's kind of what the public expect. Whereas here, we don't really have any of that. You don't have that level of collective pressure. You don't have that sense of collective responsibility, and so individual politicians can say or do things, and ultimately it's up to them to decide whether they should resign or whether they need to step back from public life. That isn't something that Tim Wald enforces. That isn't really something that anyone else can enforce. And so we do have a bit of a weakness here, I think, when compared to the UK. In the UK, there are mechanisms. They may not be perfect, but there are mechanisms whereby the electorate can, put pressure on the government and put pressure on parties and politicians to do the right thing. On the Isle of Man, it's much, much harder to do that.
Thank you for making it to the end of the Manx Radio newscast. You are obviously someone with exquisite taste. May I politely suggest you might want to subscribe to this and a wide range of Manx Radio podcasts at your favourite podcast provider, so our best bits will magically appear on your smartphone. Thank you.